What's it going to take to get the border under control? Let's talk about that for a minute. You're there in Arizona. You've got the same border issues we have here, maybe worse, I don't know, but you got the same border issues there. What do we do to get this under control?
You get the border under control by having leaders that don't give up, that never back away from a fight, that know how to build bridges. And as far as saying, listen, I'm not going to do any other legislation until we seal this hemorrhaging. You don't seal an artery as a doctor by plugging half of it with one stitch if it needs 5 stitches. You plug the whole artery or the patient will hemorrhage to death. And that's what's happening right now. We should not take anything short of sealing it completely. And then also talk about resourcing our Border Patrol to the amount necessary to actually vet and begin to have hearings about what vetting is. How do we decide what's asylum and what's not? How do we decide who's coming in because they want to embrace Americanism or simply coming in here because for purely economic or exploitative or infiltrative reasons? This is how we begin to fix our border. We end sanctuary cities where Greg Stanton, who needs to be replaced, who has been a lifetime politician, when he was Phoenix mayor, advocated for sanctuary cities, which is just an abomination and a disgrace to the American law that there's actually members of Congress and mayors across this country, as we see in California and elsewhere, that believe that cities should be sanctuary to horrific criminals that commit rape and murder and otherwise, and yet they seem to get away with it. And we're seeing a huge spike on a daily basis in these crimes. So we have the wherewithal. We just need the leadership with the cachet, as I've been developing and vetted over time now, to do that in Congress.
Do you think being a Muslim hurts you in the race?
Absolutely not. I think that ultimately, I think Muslims that are not open about their ideology, that are not contrite about the parts of Islam that we need to reform, that need especially the theocratic elements. I think any Muslim that says that normative Islam is completely compatible with American constitutional liberty is either fooling themselves or ignorant or being deceptive. The reality is, yes, the Islam that my father taught, my parents taught me, that my grandparents tried to practice, I believe is compatible. But my father translated the Quran in a modern way. I wrote in my book a lot of these problems in a battle for the soul of Islam and dedicated myself to the American Islamic Forum for Democracy that targeted these ideas. And just where, if you look before 1776 and especially 1789, even the Christian world had never understood what it meant to render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's. There are passages that need interpretation in light of modern day. Islam is 1440 plus years old. It hasn't gone through that reform. So yes, Muslims that are contrite, that are humble and open enough to say, listen, my faith practice personally is Judeo-Christian Islamic under God. It is what guides my character, my integrity, and my family values. However, the political Islam of Iran, of Saudi Arabia, of Pakistan, of the Muslim Brotherhood, of all these radical groups is incompatible. And anyone that's an operative for that should have has no business being in America and is actually an enemy of this country. But I can be the most useful in helping discern that and shed the political correctness and all of the problems that are gaslit by the Ilhan Omars and Rashida Tlaibs of the world that nobody challenges. And I can do that immediately. I can hit the ground running. I've established credibility in this area and can expand it into healthcare weaponization, DOJ weaponization, military weaponization that's been happening by the far left that I can immediately expose by the work I've been doing.
Those two, do you believe they're actually enemies of this country?
You listen to Ilhan Omar, and when she talks about Somalia, and her native tongue was translated a few months ago, she said that America was the terrorists in Somalia. And I served there. I was on USS El Paso, Operation Restore Hope, joined my ship when they returned from Somalia. And she basically had the temerity, the audacity to say, we were the terrorists when we were there in the early 90s. So I can't help but interpret that as somebody that thinks that America is the enemy and that ultimately somehow the East's problems from Somalia to Iran is not internal, but external because of the boogeyman of America that they've created. And she ultimately doesn't understand the beauty of America's promise, why we're a shining city on the hill, why individual rights and free markets. As a small business person, the other reason I'm running is I sign the front of my checks. And I've got employees that I've taken care of for decades now in primary care in an industry that I can't adjust my prices. And I realize what American families are going through. And for those who think that America's the problem, why is it that they're rushing in to come here from all over the world? Why did the Ilhan Omars and the millions coming across our borders come here? It's because there's a promise of economic freedom, of individual rights. And they want to deny that because they have an agenda that is anti-American. And I'm sorry to say it, I do believe that when it comes to idea, they might not be anarchists, but they certainly are not friends of America. And I believe their ideas are incompatible, which makes them enemies of who we are.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I'm very troubled at some of the things that I hear them say. Now, you say that you would support a 15% flat tax?
Yes, I would.
Why?
Well, I have to tell you, first of all, anything we can do to decrease the red tape and all of the empowerment of government through deductions and other things. You have a flat tax, it makes the IRS forms much simpler and much less weaponization of the IRS, as we saw with so many things into our lives. Second, it becomes an engine of growth. What we saw missing in Carter 2.0 or Obama 3.0 with Biden is in the inflationary economy, we were missing growth. And growth is stifled by a suppression, by printing money, making money less valuable, and then ultimately increasing the burden of government taxation. So if you flatten that tax and increase growth enough, which most of the studies, and you look at Steve Forbes' work and so many others, they will show that a flat tax works and ultimately will reawaken America's engine and do that through energy, also fracking. And, we should be drilling and no longer dependent on the theocratic oil, the petro-Islam of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, and letting our own economic engine thrive and begin to have spillover into other parts of our economy beyond energy.
Well, I've seen study after study where when you lower tax rates, you increase tax revenue. Is that what you think would happen?
Absolutely. Every study shows that the more you give Americans freedom to invest in our future, invest in their own businesses, they will have more freedom to create things that will generate more money and ultimately enlarge our economy and diversify our economy. So a flat tax rate is all about diversity. It's about diversity of economics. And listen, I've been seeing now in healthcare consolidation of the markets, where the largest employer of doctors now is no longer private practices, but it's actually Optum, it's insurance companies. And you're seeing huge consolidation, which Congress should be stepping in to protect small businesses, to allow incentives to reinvigorate that engine of small business ingenuity, where I, as the president of my clinic, can talk to my frontline folks and institute and implement their ideas for change in a much quicker way than huge metaglomerates that are like aircraft carriers that were created by Obamacare that can't be shifted. So right now, 18% of the American GDP is healthcare. If you can begin to reoperationalize free markets by lowering their tax rates and helping small businesses with incentives, you will decrease the wait time. Right now, I've talked to patients that takes them 3 to 6 months or more to find a primary care doc and even see them. So that old Obamacare nonsense in which they said, oh, you can keep your doctor, et cetera, is the biggest lie, one of the biggest lies from Obamacare. And there's so many others. And this is why not only flat tax rates, but stopping and beginning to disincentivize the private equity buyouts in healthcare and so many other things that happen in healthcare is going to take the best healthcare system on the planet and make it mediocre because we've not incentivized free markets in it anymore. It's become socialized, basically.
Well, I did a show just today, and we were talking about the fact that 97% of antibiotics are coming out of China. If you look at the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients for these, not just antibiotics, but all of these different pharmaceutical agents, they're all coming from foreign countries. We're not getting these things from domestic labs or soils. And I'm just wondering what happens if China decides to just stop shipping that stuff. It seems to me that we could be in a real pickle, and that's been the case for at least 20 years. Why is somebody not doing something about that? And I understand that they're competing with a government, not another company, and they're paying 47 cents an hour in some of their factories and stuff over there. But it seems to me that when we're dependent on our enemy for life-saving sorts of things, we're really putting ourselves in a vulnerable position.
You're so on target, Dr. Phil, and especially after the pandemic, when we saw now the empowerment of the World Health Organization that China was driving, dictatorships are driving. And, for all the brilliance of Henry Kissinger and others in the 20th century, one of the worst ideas we've seen in the last 100 years was the open door to China, that somehow, as even Clinton then articulated in the 90s, he said, oh, China, as we open and become economically engaged, will become moderated, and then ultimately the CCP will fall apart. That's not how it works. Just like with maximum pressure against Iran, as President Trump and Pompeo did, sanctions work because as long as you have a dictatorship, and I can tell you, family that's been tortured by dictatorships in Syria and across the Middle East, dictators will suck like parasites the life out of the monies that come into their country and out of every business. And ultimately, you're right. FDA reform here in America, this might be radical, but I've always said, as a liberty-minded doctor, the government's role is to make sure that small businesses, large businesses aren't exploiting and hurting the population. So yes, safety is something that I do think the government should be involved in, but not efficacy. A big part, 70 to 80% of the cost of bringing a drug to market comes from efficacy studies. Let patients, we saw in the pandemic, the government started to prevent patients from even articulating on social media whether ivermectin or other things. Listen, I didn't believe in that scientifically, but I was horrified that my government was preventing my patients from engaging in that, and that somehow we had to force vaccines, force masks. I mean, we were really, just as I talk about on my website, we were a few steps away from doing what China did by welding their patients into homes, but saying, and to prevent the spread of a virus. And we did all this disease trading and other things. So all of these things feed to one another, where a autocratic, oppressive society rationalizes step 1 and 2, and then all of a sudden step 5 and 6 into authoritarianism becomes the next steps for destroying our democracy.